But I want to introduce you to someone, an early church member that you may not be familiar with. And his name is Orson Spencer. Now, the reason I begin with him is because this is the book that we'll be spending our time in, okay? The 2013 edition of the Book of Mormon. But I want you to picture getting one of these, which was the 1830 edition. Imagine if, you heard a knock on your cabin door somewhere on the American frontier, that early 19th century, and you saw a stranger outside the door that pulled out of his knapsack a book just like this one, and said that it was a gift from God that was meant to prepare the earth for the second coming of Jesus Christ. Bold claim for a frontier missionary. Would you give him the time of day? Would you accept a copy of this book? Or would you reject them out of hand because of rumors you'd already heard or stories you'd already read about in the newspaper? You see, years ago, I wrote a master's thesis on the early rejection history of the Book of Mormon. And what I did for this was I read every newspaper article I could find from 1829 till 1844, when Joseph Smith died, describing the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. You see, the penny press was spreading far and wide in the early 19th century. Press was cheap, technology was improving, and practically everybody wanted to put out a shingle and start a printing press or a newspaper. Many of the editors at the time, unfortunately, were religious skeptics, and they used the power of the press to try to push back the power of the pulpit. It was a competition going on, a tug of war between faith and doubt at that time period. You still read the messages of Thomas Paine, for example. He was the patron saint of skepticism in early America. A doubting Thomas, like Americans had never read before. And people were really wrestling with their belief in the Bible or their belief in God. And so onto the scene comes a story about a gold Bible and angels that have come back to earth and some frontier prophet who was translating by the gift and power of God. Now, to an audience in the effulgent glow of the American Enlightenment, that sounded ludicrous. And the way that newspaper editors, skeptical for the most part, described that made it all the harder to believe that any of these things could even be possible. What struck me most from that study was newspaper article after newspaper article, they seemed to reduce the story of the Book of Mormon to the absurd, in hopes that people would dismiss it out of hand without even opening the book to see what was inside. There is provenance, and then there is product. Provenance is where things come from. Product is what's actually in front of you on the page. And I was amazed at how infrequently anyone actually cracked the book open to see what was written inside. They couldn't get past the stories surrounding it. Again, like we're studying this week, the testimonies of the 3 and 8 witnesses, the story that Joseph Smith tells of how he received the gold plates to begin with, the ministering of angels in his life, Urim and Thummim, and all of these things that a skeptical audience simply could not swallow. And so what do? They make it a knee-jerk reaction to ridicule. If you think about those in the great and spacious building that mocked and pointed the finger, and that's what led people to leave the iron rod and even drop the fruit that they had just partaken of. That seems to be the adversary's modus operandi. It's what he does. And so to see that happening on the pages of the penny press in the 19th century, I am astonished that any of our ancestors could get over that initial reaction. The first impression that most people would have had before any missionary knocked on their cabin door would have been decidedly negative. And so to picture a Samuel Smith offering you a copy of the book his brother had just translated, most people would have simply laughed in his face and said, "You didn't get it? This was all a joke, and now the joke's on you, and you become the butt of ridicule and scorn. Like I said, I'm amazed that any of our ancestors could get past that and actually open the book and see what was written therein. That's what amazes me most about this man I want to introduce you to, namely Orson Spencer. Now, what amazes me about him is that he was so well educated, far more than most early converts to the church. He grew up in New England. He had been a Baptist minister. He was the valedictorian at the theological school where he went to study the Bible, and very, very well respected because he was so well educated. Well, he heard the stories. He'd heard all those stories, the knee-jerk reaction, and yet convinced by someone close to him to at least try, crack the book open and see what's inside. It started to change everything for him. He ended up joining the church in 1841. Moving to Nauvoo, he was appointed the very first chancellor, if you want to call it that, of the University of Nauvoo, as it was trying to get underway. And when the saints moved west, eventually, after having served several missions in Europe, he was named the very first chancellor of the University of Deseret, what became the University of Utah. Again, incredibly well educated and admired by his Baptist congregations up until the point where he left them to join this upstart sect, the Latter-day Saints. Now, there is a fascinating letter that he wrote to an old friend of his in response to that friend's petition. Explain to me and to all of us, how on earth did you get duped into this belief of gold Bibles and stone spectacles and angels talking to plowboys? We thought you were smarter than that, Orson. And Orson's response is a very long letter that was later published in the Times and Seasons in Nauvoo. It's a masterpiece of explanation. It is a peek into how the minds and hearts of early converts, especially those that had the courage to face the calumny, that had the conviction to be able to stand up in the face of ridicule. It's a very long letter, and I love the whole thing, but I'm just going to share 4 statements from what he said by way of introduction to what we're going to be studying this year. In explanation of his conversion, he wrote, "The Spirit of God wrought mightily in me, commending the ancient gospel to my conscience." And it was that ancient gospel he found in the pages of the Book of Mormon, that he found in the revelations of the prophet Joseph Smith. This was not some new upstart. This was the ancient gospel. And the Spirit of God commended it to him. I contemplated it with peaceful serenity and joy in believing. Visions and dreams began to illuminate occasionally my slumbering moments. But, he said, when I allowed my selfish propensities to speak, I cursed Mormonism in my heart and regretted being in possession of as much light and knowledge as had flowed into my mind from that source. Do you get a sense of him being the rope in this tug of war and being pulled in one direction by the Spirit of God himself, but being yanked back in the other by his cares for what people would think of him? I will lose everything. I will lose all respectability. I will become the butt of their ridicule. In fact, he already had been. But what was he to do? Curse Mormonism and leave behind what he knew from God was true? Later he said, I counted the cost to myself and my family of embracing such views until I could read it like the child his alphabet, either upward or downward. You understand what he's saying there? A child that is reviewing his letters until he knows them inside and outside, upwards and down. He knew the cost of this conversion. He knew what it would mean for him. It was constantly on his mind. He said, the expense I viewed through unavoidable tears, both in public and private, by night and by day. I said, however, the Lord, he is God. I will embrace the truth. And so he did. But as he described to his old Baptist friend, the the process of his investigation, I'm amazed at how seriously he took things. Again, he's so well educated. He does not want to be duped. He said, while I was inquiring to know what the Lord would have me to do, many brethren of different denominations warned and exhorted me faithfully. But their warnings consisted very much in a lively exhibition of evils to be endured if I persisted. Or in other words, they appealed to my selfish nature. This is interesting self-awareness on the part of Orson Spencer. They are just trying to scare me out of my faith. They want to shock and awe me into thinking, oh, the price that must be paid if you follow this new group. No, it's worth it to just stay here with us and continue your respectable ministry. But Orson Spencer considered that selfish on his part, self-centered. He said, I knew too well that truth should not be abandoned through the force of such appeals, however eloquently urged. Some with whom I conversed gave glowing descriptions of the obnoxious character of Joseph Smith and of the contradictory and unscriptural jargon of the Book of Mormon. But it was their misfortune usually to be deplorably ignorant of the true characters of either. You see what he's saying there? He realized what I learned in that study, that people are talking about the story behind the scripture, but they're not reading the scripture themselves. It's rumor with her 1,000 tongues, scaring people out of an honest investigation. That has been happening ever since. And the internet has only multiplied those tongues of rumor far beyond the original 1,000. Honestly, if you have been bombarded by other people's opinions of the Book of Mormon, perhaps now's your chance to silence the maddening crowd and approach the text as if it were a brand new experience for you. It's a modern actress, very famous, I won't drop her name, but she once said that the problem with being famous is you can no longer give people first impressions. Before they meet you, they assume they know you. And that's definitely the case with the Book of Mormon. The way it was initially framed by skeptical editors gave the world a negative first impression of the text. And it's one that the Book of Mormon has not yet been able to overcome. Just go ask a certain Tony Award-winning Broadway musical. And again, it is still the butt of ridicule, as it's always been. But to try it, to get past our ignorant first impressions, or even if you think you know the text, and for whatever reason you have pulled away from faith in it, I challenge you to try what Orson Spencer did and approach it as if you were seeing it for the first time. Now, one of the things that Orson Spencer did fascinates me, especially as a student of anti-Mormonism myself. In this letter, he said this. This is the last of the quotes that I'll share with you, although there are so many more that I wish we had time for. He said, I read diligently the Book of Mormon from beginning to end, and I would challenge us all to do the same thing this year. But he said this, I read it in close connection with the comments of Origen Batchelor, Leroy Sunderland, and Dr. Hurlbut, together with newspapers and some private letters obtained from the surviving friends of Mr. Spalding, the supposed author of that book. Now, some of you may know some of those names. They're all well familiar to me, because those were the names of the most popular, or some of the most popular anti-Mormons in the early period. Origen Batchelor and Leroy Sunderland and Dr. Hurlbut had all written exposés to try to paint a picture of early Mormonism in the most negative possible hues. The Mr. Spalding he mentions here is Solomon Spalding of Spalding theory fame. And the idea that this book is far too complicated for an uneducated farm boy to write, so Joseph must have somehow collaborated with someone else. He must have plagiarized this, stolen a manuscript. And what's fascinating to me, again, one who studies anti-religious rhetoric, having studied the writings of these anti-Mormons myself, it's fascinating to picture Orson Spencer with Book of Mormon in one hand and exposés of Mormonism in the other, and trying to make sense of the two. He went on, I arose from its perusal with a strong conviction on my mind that its pages were graced with the pen of inspiration. I was surprised that so little fault could be found with a book of such magnitude, treating as it did of such diversified subjects through a period of so many generations. It appeared to me that no enemy to truth or godliness would ever take the least interest in publishing the contents of such a book. Such appeared to me to be its godly bearing, sound morality, and harmony with ancient scriptures, that the enemy of all righteousness might as well proclaim the dissolution of his own kingdom as to spread the contents of such a volume among men. You see what he's saying there? It's like, man, if the devil inspired this book, boy, he shot himself in the foot. Because it pulls people away from him, not toward. It teaches light, not darkness. What a house divided against itself cannot stand. And if the devil wrote this book, then he's destroying his own best efforts. He finished this paragraph with this incredible statement. From that time to this, so since his initial introduction to the book and his subsequent study of it, every effort made by its enemies to demolish has only shown how invincible a fortress defends it. And I am amazed by the invincibility of the fortress of faith. Having studied so much of what people have said against the Book of Mormon, from its initial, actually that's the irony, anti-Mormonism precedes Mormonism. And anti-Book of Mormon articles appeared before the Book of Mormon did. Oh, there's a long life there. And having studied it in the 19th century, as well as continuing to study what is being produced right now in the 21st, I will still stand by this scriptural text. And I'm amazed by its invincibility. There is something powerful here, and my honest hope for us all, wherever you happen to be on the spectrum, if you are a lifelong believer, and it doesn't even make sense to you how anyone could doubt the Book of Mormon, or on the other side, if you are a lifelong skeptic, if you are curious about this book, but want to avoid conviction, welcome. Wherever you happen to be, just come. Come and see. Come and read. Don't take my word for any of this. But as we study together, please know that I am not going to try to force my beliefs on anyone. I will simply point out some of the places where I have found light and truth pouring forth from the pages of the Book of Mormon. I will aim for application and relevance. I want to establish historical context. I want to equip you so that you can enter the text in an informed way. I want to plant some seeds of curiosity so that you can study things and begin to interrogate the text in a dialogue rather than a monologue. Not just it speaking to you or you speaking at it, but rather conversation that hopefully will include God himself and open the heavens so that you can see what this book is intended to make of you. Oh, there's something incredible awaiting us. And so, with the help of Orson Spencer cheering us on from the grave, so many saints and skeptics pulling on this book and trying to convince people one way or the other how to respond to it. Again, may we get past the stories surrounding its coming forth and enter its pages directly to see what it has to say to us. An incredible adventure awaits us all, and an incredible infusion of power if we go about this study in the right way.